Hello everyone, this is your instructor, Dr. Maringer. Last week we had a discussion post question on the Black Legend of Spanish Barbarism. We asked how the Black Legend of Spanish Barbarism misinterpreted history, and as the second part to that question we asked how the Black Legend robbed indigenous people of historical agency. This is an interesting topic, and it's one that invokes a lot of passion among students and people in general. And so I wanted to create a little screencast here to go over this question with everybody and clarify some of the issues here. So before we get started, let's revisit some of the terms here, redefine some of the terms. The Black Legend of Spanish Barbarism. Okay, the Black Legend of Spanish Barbarism is a historical interpretation that condemns the Spanish as a corrupt and cruel people who subjugated and exploited New World indigenous people while killing them in unprecedented numbers. This is this negative portrayal of Spanish colonialism is one that's been propagated by Protestant rivals of the Spanish crown since the 16th and 17th centuries. The British and the Dutch primarily. Ironically, the Black Legend drew upon criticisms first voiced by Spaniards themselves, like Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar and defender of indigenous peoples. And this, of course, gives further credence to this perspective, the Black Legend. The Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is an exchange of animals and diseases and plants between the Old World, the Afro-Eurasian world, and the New World, the Americas. It's named for Christopher Columbus because that's when the first two worlds are meeting each other on a large-scale basis. Historical agency. Agency refers to the power of individuals, groups, or institutions to resist, blunt, or alter historical conditions. You can also think of it as the ability of persons or groups to express free will in the past, or to be considered as having free will in the past to determine their own course of historical events. Okay, let's get to the question then. The key to answering the question about the Black Legend was understanding the significance of the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, according to ethnocentric interpretations, or Eurocentric interpretations, has been celebrated as the Grand Exchange. When we wed the New World tomato, for example, with Old World wheat, we have pizza, which we can all appreciate, right? But the Columbian Exchange is different if you have if you're looking at it from a Native American perspective. From a Native American perspective, the Columbian Exchange was catastrophic because the diseases introduced by the Europeans wiped out indigenous peoples in great numbers, far greater numbers than the amount of people that had been killed in the Black Death in Europe, for example. Remember that this is partially because of the lack of genetic diversity among indigenous people made them especially susceptible to European diseases, in the sense that if one group fell, they all fell. This is a consequence of the founding population of the Americas being one that lived in genetic isolation in Beringia for thousands of years before moving down to populate the Americas. The convention now is that 90% of the population centers will lose their population, will die off, of the indigenous populations, will die off over the course of the first century of contact. This is a graph that shows the population, how the Mayan population of Guatemala was affected, for example. Here we see a population that starts off around 2 million at the time of the first encounter with Europeans. By the time you get to the end of the century, we see that that population has dropped off 90% or more to less than 200,000 people. That population does not recover throughout the colonial period nor into the present time. This is a graph that shows the same thing happening in Mesoamerica. Successive epidemics of new diseases being introduced will take a population that's estimated around 22 million down to maybe 1 million by the time you get to 1600, year 1600. And these are, again, some examples of Mesoamerica and the Mayan people in Central America. But when the Europeans encountering the indigenous people in Massachusetts and New York, they heard similar accounts from those people that our numbers used to be 10 times as great. Okay, so on to the question of the Black Legend and as a misinterpretation of history. How does the Black Legend misinterpret history? Well, primarily the Black Legend misinterprets history. It's not to say that Spaniards weren't cruel in their dealings with the indigenous people and did not commit atrocities, because we know they did, but it falsely attributes the demographic collapse of indigenous America to Spanish barbarism, while ignoring the virgin soil epidemics introduced through the Columbian Exchange. Another misinterpretation brought by the Black Legend is the idea that the Spaniards were invincible, godlike people, right? And we see, maybe not so much, they're not as popular as they used to be, but the encounters of the Spaniards being mistaken for gods, these were interpretations that were created generations after the initial encounter, but had been propagated through the years as a way of explaining how else could they defeat these native people if the native people themselves didn't see them as gods and therefore just give up. That brings us to the third bubble here. Indigenous peoples lose agency in the face of inevitable conquest. According to the Black Legend of Spanish barbarism, the indigenous people had no defenses against the Spaniards and therefore just gave up. We don't even have to consider their story because they immediately gave up under the superior technology or culture or whatever. That is that we don't consider that maybe indigenous people fought back against the Spaniards, or that indigenous people in some cases allied themselves with the Spaniards to fight against enemies, other indigenous people who were enemies, that sort of thing. The final point here is that the Black Legend is a misinterpretation because it suggests that Spain's Protestant rivals, the British and the Dutch primarily, treated indigenous people better than Catholic Spaniards did, and that's simply not the case. Residual effects of the demographic collapse brought by the Columbian Exchange. Consider what it means to lose 90% of your population over the course of the first century of the encounter. One thing that we know is that this facilitates conquest. The gradual conquest of indigenous people is certainly facilitated by this process. We know that, for example, in the final assault on Tenochtitlan, there was a smallpox epidemic in which the penultimate Aztec emperor Cuitlahuac died of smallpox. We know also that Huayna Capac, the Inca father of Atahualpa and Huayna and Huáscar Inca, that he died some 5 years before the Spanish conquistador Pizarro even arrived. He died of smallpox even 5 years before the Spanish conquistador Pizarro arrived in Peru. This means that these diseases were spreading faster than the Spanish conquistadors were themselves. This, of course, leads to a facilitation of colonization as well. This map shows a map of the world towards the end of the early modern period. At the end of the early modern period, that's a period that stretches from about 1450 to about 1750, we see that there's a lot of colonization going on in the Americas. But in Africa, in Asia, these areas that Europeans are encountering through their maritime explorations. At the same time, they are not colonizing those areas. There will be widespread colonization in Africa, for example, after the Industrial Revolution, but not at this point. Why? Because the people of the Americas have suffered these epidemics, and therefore the Americas will be colonized while these other places aren't. Another consequence of this, of course, is racial miscegenation, racial hierarchy, a racial hierarchy that puts the whites on top and the indigenous and Afro-Americans on the bottom. Finally, Eurocentric interpretations of conquest in indigenous America, again, are another consequence of the demographic collapse brought by the Columbian Exchange. For centuries, even before people understood the effect of the diseases, how else could they understand the facility, the ease in which conquest was achieved, but by assuming the European technological or cultural superiority was such that the native people just would never have a chance. Again, so that brings us back to this issue of Native Americans losing agency as they're seen powerless against European conquerors. The stories of indigenous resistance or collaboration with the Europeans is lost because we just do not even consider the indigenous perspective. So I hope that helps with this topic, and we'll be talking later. So see you on the discussion board.